And so you referred him to me, we conferred, and he was engaged in this case, correct?
That's correct. I've known Lance for about the last 30. Correct. We have a forensic pathologist on our staff, Dr. David Posey. Dr. Posey also has a background as an Army medical doctor, very familiar with gunshot wounds and wound ballistics, and I thought that Dr. Posey would be an excellent candidate to assist on our team.
Okay. And then based on the dynamics that are involved in cases like this, did you also recommend a psychologist that's familiar with the issues that are typically involved in police shooting cases and uses of force?
Correct. We have 3 that we use, and I thought that Dr. Chris Johnson, with his background with Naval Special Warfare, would be excellent, because this involves basically large-scale shooting. All right.
By making any referrals or by virtue of the fact that these other experts have submitted reports in this case, have you dictated to anyone what their findings should be?
No, we don't work that way. We're a multidisciplinary set of analysts, and I don't, as director, dictate anything that these other professionals do.
Are these individuals independent contractors?
Everybody that works for me is an independent contractor, except for 2 of our full-time employees.
Okay. What type of forensic cases do you work on personally?
Well, I personally like police practices case and civilian self-defense cases. So with regards to, for instance, in the civil side, I like cases that have allegations of 4th, 8th, and 14th Amendment allegations. With respect to criminal cases, I like complex crimes of violence, shootings, stabbings, anything dealing with use of force, whether it's in a criminal or a civil environment. I like personally that's my preference of cases.
And what percentage of civil cases are you retaining where you are defending agencies and officers?
Right now, I think I'm at about 60% agency defense and about 40% a combination of either plaintiff cases, criminal defense, prosecutorial, court appointments, things like that.
Are you currently, or have you been a retained expert for any states or municipalities?
Yes. Currently, I'm the Attorney General's expert, been retained by the states of Alaska, Nevada, New Mexico. I've also experted, and I'm currently with the state of Illinois. I've also experted for the state of Nebraska, West Virginia, and then large municipalities around the country.
Are you a police practice and forensic criminal investigation expert for the United States Marine Corps Judge Advocates General Office, West Coast, Camp Pendleton?
That's correct. I work as a police and law enforcement and forensic investigations expert for the Judge Advocate General Corps for the Marine Corps, based out of Camp Pendleton.
And have you also been retained special investigator for the City of Riverside Police Community Review Commission?
Correct. That's an independent review commission taking a look. And by the way, my particular, I no longer have that position. I had it for about 4 years. And my specific areas of investigation and analysis and reporting to that body was officer-involved shootings and in-custody deaths.
And that's commonly referred to as a police review board, correct?
It's the same thing. We call it a little bit something different, but it is exactly the same thing.
Okay. Out of the police practice death cases you've worked on, how many of those have been officer-involved shootings?
I think I've been retained in over somewhere between 50 and 60, I would say.
Okay. And could you set forth your educational background and degrees that you hold?
Sure. I've got a bachelor's degree in exercise physiology, physical education with emphasis in exercise physiology from California Polytechnic State University in California. I've got master's degrees in justice administration and public administration from Golden Gate University in San Francisco. I've got a doctorate degree in criminology with emphasis in forensic psych from Columbia Pacific University in San Rafael. Had some elective studies from John F. Kennedy University in public and justice administration in the East Bay of San Francisco Bay Area.
And have you taught or supervised any law enforcement training programs or classes pertaining to the issues in this case?
Yes, I'm a former police academy director. Directed one of 34 accredited police academies in the state of California on behalf of the California Commission on Peace Officer Standards and Training. I was a division dean of criminal justice and fire science for Modesto Junior College, which is an accredited college in the state of California, where the academy is based. And then I have supervised or been involved in training well over 300 agencies in the United States and internationally.
In addition to the degrees that you've testified about, do you have any board certifications in forensic trauma?
Yes, I hold a fellowship with the National Center of Crisis Management and the American College of Experts in Traumatic Stress, and my certification is in forensic traumatology, which is an emotional and psychological trauma. My specific area is stress-induced incidents, officers experiencing intense stress, citizens experiencing intense stress.
Are you a certified force analyst through the Force Science Center at Minnesota State University?
That's correct. I'm a graduate from Minnesota State University with the Force Science Center, which is an accredited body.
And are you a graduate of the Los Angeles Police Department's Force Investigation Division Use of Force and Officer-Involved Shooting School?
I am.
Is that considered to be one of the best in the nation?
Yes, both Minnesota State and also FID, or the Force Investigation Division from Los Angeles Police Department, are two of the most prominent schools that deal with major uses of force investigations in the world.
Tell us about your law enforcement background.
I started out in 1975 with the Redwood City Police Department. That's a medium-sized agency in the San Francisco Bay Area. I worked for that agency for a little over 2 years, and I took a lateral transfer to a large agency, which was the San Jose Police Department. San Jose being, I believe, the fourth largest city in the state of California. And I worked for the San Jose Police Department for just a little over 15 years. Actually had retired from San Jose Police Department, received a pension from them, and took the job as a director of Criminal Justice Training Center and Division Dean of Criminal Justice over in Modesto, and stayed in that position for about 2 years, and then moved down to Central California on the coast and continued my private practice all along, and then took a job initially as a reserve officer with the Morro Bay Police Department, which is a very small police department, and was a police officer and detective there. I worked there for about 3 years and returned to private practice.
Can you give us a brief description of the type of work you've done as a police officer in your career? Types of assignments?
Sure. The majority of the time that I was involved in law enforcement, which is a little over 22 years, most of it was in field patrol. So I've been a patrol officer, just like any other patrol officer, handling all patrol assignments, traffic investigations, criminal investigations, crimes against people and property. And I've had specialized assignments as a field training officer with one of the nation's model field training programs. I was one of 3 training coordinators for the San Jose field training program. I was a senior field training officer. I became an administrative assistant to the district supervisor, which is between being a senior FTO and that position or supervisory responsibilities in the patrol division. I was a detective in crimes against persons and people. I was a gang investigator for years. I also worked in the fraud unit, and I've worked undercover. I was a robbery decoy officer and a prostitution decoy officer working undercover for 3.5 years. And my other assignments have been as a detective investigating sexual assaults. I was both a narcotics registration officer and a sexual predator registration officer while I was a detective. So I've had a variety of assignments.
Okay. Outside of the education and forensic certifications that you hold, are you an instructor in the use of force?
Yes, I hold pretty much every type of instructor certification at the instructor or master instructor level of all levels of force and weaponry in law enforcement. Been a firearms instructor for a number of years, both in the law enforcement and in the civilian communities. So pretty much everything that police officers are allowed to use in the field.
Have you been given any commendation awards for your work as a police officer or detective?
I have.
Could you enumerate on that?
Yes, sir. I have about 140 letters of commendations and awards, 3 outstanding duty awards, a hazardous duty award, and a nomination for a Medal of Valor.
Have you been qualified as a police practice expert in federal court before?
On numerous occasions.
And what about in state court?
Same.
Have you ever been qualified as an expert in use of force cases?
Yes, sir.
Approximately how many times have you testified in your career?
Well, it's been a number of times that I've testified in either...
As an expert witness, I'm sorry.
As an expert witness, it's been numerous times that I've testified in either state or federal court.
Have you published any text, manuals, or articles in the area of law enforcement and or forensics?
I have.
And could you please describe them?
I've written 4 books dealing with crime and criminal investigations. I've written probably 32 or more law enforcement manuals dealing with everything from criminal investigations to psychomedical emergencies to in-custody death, how to respond to officer-involved shootings, how to respond to in-custody deaths. I've written a field training officer manual for supervisors and FTOs. I've published numerous articles on the use of force, on police practices, on some areas of forensics that are peer-reviewed, appear in national magazines. I'm a contributing writer for Police Magazine, Police and Security News, the Police Officers Research of California magazine, a couple of others. I'm also a media consultant for the History and Discovery channels that deal with law enforcement and forensic issues there.
Okay. Have you ever conducted any independent forensic research on any use of force topic?
I have.
Please elaborate.
Most recently, I've done, I think, the only international peer-reviewed research on the psychological and physiological effects of load, which is electronic current from tasers on individuals. Recently published an article referred to as the 21-foot rule, which is it discusses the reactionary gap, action-reaction time for police officers who are armed against individuals that are armed with edged weapons, things of that sort.
And in conjunction with your work, have you ever submitted to being voluntarily tased before with a taser?
Tased?
Yes.
Yes, I'm somewhat of a sick person. I've been shot with a taser at least a half a dozen times. I've been influenced by a taser over 25 times, from drive stuns to basically tased wires. There's a device that we can hook ourselves up to test taser current. I've had that done a bunch of times so that I can do research and also testify on the effects of load on individuals.
And what about being voluntarily exposed to a chemical agent such as OC spray?
I've been exposed over 20 times to oleoresin capsicum or OC spray. When the new products come out, I've tested myself. I've been sprayed with these products so that I can know what the effects are and be able to train other officers in the effects and also testify to those effects in court if I need to.
May I approach, Your Honor?
Sure.
I want to hand you and ask you to identify defendants' exhibits QQ, RR, and SS, and identify those if you can.
QQ is going to be my resume.
And if I may, how many pages is that document?
Well, I don't know if it has page numbers, but I would tell you that it's about 20 pages.
This is my notepad, it says 22, but I note that it's not numbered.
Okay.
Better take care of that. Does this set forth your education that we've just covered and your faculty memberships?
Yes, have been. I'm too busy right now, but I've been an adjunct professor to several accredited universities in California and the United States.
Does it also list any visiting lectureships you've had?
Yes, I've had about 10 or 12 visiting lectureships, both within and in the educational, law enforcement, and military communities.
And does it also set forth your professional certifications?
Correct. I have a number of them.
Your instructor certifications, correct?
Correct. I have about 30 of those.
And your awards and special achievements, correct?
Correct. I have a number of those.
And without going through all your professional memberships, can you give us some of the significant ones?
Sure. Let me, that's a little hard for me to read, Mr. Brelo, so let me just go into this document, which is the same one you have. I think the ones that are important to me is having been a member of the California Academy Directors Association, International Associations of Chiefs of Police, International Association of Coroners and Medical Examiners, because I have a medical background, the National Center for Crisis Management, and the American College of Forensic Examiners Institute, and we already talked about the other one, the International Law Enforcement Educators and Trainers Association, which is the predominant law enforcement training association worldwide. And I think for those issues, I think that's important. Just for the other issues, United States Navy SEAL Association for some of the psychophysiological factors. So.
And then next, do Do you have publications that you have authored?
Yes, and I spoke about those. Those are the 4 texts that I've written, and then those are training manuals that are coming up in a variety of areas: law enforcement, use of force, psychophysiology, some medical areas, weaponry.
And are these articles that you have authored?
Correct. And just in the last couple of years, I've written quite a bit.
And then you have a section here for documentaries and news, film, television, radio, print media. Could you describe what that's about?
Well, from time to time, I do interviews as a police practices expert and a forensic expert for the media. Last Thursday or last Wednesday, I had an article in USA Today talking about the importance of law enforcement reserve programs. They call me from time to time. Various national television programs, CNN, people like that call me to work. I was just brought on One American News Network as their police, law enforcement, and crime expert. And that's a cable television channel.
And if you also attend professional courses to keep current?
Yes, sir. In the last 6 years, between attending courses and instructing, I think I've logged over 900 hours. I believe 150 or more hours just on use of force, about 400 hours in firearms, and about 125 hours on medical issues. So.
I think you pointed out to me before that you attend more continuing education classes that attorneys in Ohio have to.
Yeah, I wanted to ask a question of how many hours attorneys attend to keep their bar certification a year, and I was advised 12. I do 152 a year.
Again, turning your attention to Defendant's Exhibit RR. Is that the report that you prepared relative to your examination of this case for me?
Yes.
And it's dated January 7th, 2015, correct?
That's correct.
And directing your attention to Defendant's Exhibit SS. Is that a supplement report that you prepared in this manner?
Mr. D'Angelo, I want to just correct ourselves. Actually, there's 2 reports, but this one that's RR is the first. Is my first report, and just to correct the date, it's October 18th, 2014, and then there's a supplemental report.
The report that I'm making reference to here, Defendant's Exhibit SS, is that a report that's dated March 17, 2015?
You know what? Let me see if I have 1 second, sir, please.
It's a document.
Let's see. This is March 17th.
Correct.
Yes, sir. Oh, I'm sorry, sir. You're right. I'm mistaken.
Right. The prosecutor's checking on their copy.
What are you mistaken on, the date of RR? The first
Yes, sir.
So it is 1/8/2015?
It's January. Well, there's two. The primary report was done January 7th,
January 7th.
2015, and then there's a very short supplemental report, and that appears on March 17, 2015, Your Honor.
Gotcha. Thank you.
And was that supplemental report prepared for your review of the White decision from the Ohio Supreme Court?
That's correct.
I don't have that. It was attached to one of our filings to the court as an exhibit provided to them. It should be on the court's document.
Well, I'll say this. We're going to break in about 20 minutes or so. Are you going to get to SS within 20 minutes or so?
I'm sorry, Ryan?
Are you going to get to SS within 20 minutes or so?
Maybe not. Hopefully.
Well, let's see how it goes, but we should figure out whether the state has or has not been provided a copy.
Okay, if you could turn your attention to your report, the first expert report, RR.
Yes, sir.
May I approach, Your Honor?
Sure. Yeah.
Report that's dated January 17, 2015.
Yes, sir.
Okay, I misheard you. I thought it was January 7th. It's not a big deal, but...
Your Honor. Oh, wait a minute. You're referring to RR, Mr.
Yes.
Brelo?
D'Angelo.
I'm sorry, D'Angelo. I'm sorry.
It's all right.
7th, okay. I agree.
It's late in the day, we're all getting tired.
I know.
Okay, we have the right report now, January 7, 2015, Defendant's Exhibit RR.
Yes, sir, we do.
You with me? Okay. Does your report indicate the materials that you reviewed?
Yes.
And did you review these materials in order for you to have a basis upon which to opine in this case?
I did.
And I'm going to direct your attention to page 5 of your report. Does that set forth the documents that you reviewed?
Yes, beginning on page 5.
And it's numbered 1 through 26 in terms of discovery, and then item 27 sets forth case law, correct?
That's correct. And then it goes into other documents that I normally refer to when I'm dealing with the issues pertinent to this case.
Those are texts and articles and things of that nature.
Correct. Research, texts, articles dealing with investigations, forensics, psychophysiology.
That goes up to number 98, correct?
Yes, sir.
As a result of reviewing these materials, did you form an opinion or a number of opinions with respect to Officer Brelo's use of force in this case?
I did.
On page 17, would you please indicate to the court your opinion number 1 that you rendered in this case? And as a preliminary, are all your opinions rendered in your report based on a reasonable degree of certainty in the area of police practices and procedures?
Yes, and I use other things as well, but yes.
Please enumerate those other fields.
Occasionally I will use applied science, I will use medicine.
And do your opinions also relate to the your area of expertise in uses of force?
Yes.
And are your opinions, again, based on a reasonable degree of professional certainty in those fields?
They are.
Could you please state your first opinion that you've rendered in this case?
Yes. Opinion number one, Officer Michael Brelo's use of deadly force upon suspects Timothy Russell and Malissa Williams was objectively reasonable in consideration with the totality of circumstances that existed when the force was applied.
Your report at that point goes on from page 17 to page 30, where you set forth the bases for your report, correct?
Yes, sir.
For your opinion, rather.
That is correct.
And those are set forth in paragraphs 1.1 through 1.37, correct?
Yes.
So could you please explain to the court the forensic evidence and the facts that support your opinion that you just stated?
With respect to the circumstances, facts, and forensic evidence, there are a number of them. Beginning at 1.18 at page 19, I discussed what, based on the circumstances, statements, facts, and forensic evidence, what Officer Brelo indicates his collective knowledge of the incident were. Collective knowledge to police practices expert refers to the officer's education, training, and experience in law enforcement and moment by moment as the incident unfolds. And so I state on 1.18 that in the immediate case it's important to understand that Officer Brelo and the other shooting officers had to make immediate tactical and force decisions based upon imperfect information. During this incident, the collective knowledge and facts that Officer Brelo relied upon that caused him to reasonably believe that his life and the life of Officer Moore were in imminent danger of serious bodily injury or death, sufficient to apply deadly force, and I would also add other officers as well, because he mentions that throughout the information that I reviewed. Number one, he was engaged in a vehicle pursuit with two suspects who were fleeing for police capture. And officers are trained to understand that suspects who flee from capture is an indication of perhaps a consciousness of guilt born from criminal activity. He was aware that the suspects in the vehicle were reported to be speeding at over 120 miles, speeding recklessly, running red lights, crossing into opposing lanes of traffic, and endangering lives of citizens and police involved in the pursuit. Based on that knowledge, it would have been objectively reasonable for Officer Brelo, based upon his education and his training and experience, to believe that the suspects were engaged in serious criminal activity that was life-threatening. During the pursuit, Officer Brelo reports that he heard a radio broadcast from Officer Mann that a Chevy Malibu containing two black males were armed and had fired a shot. He then heard Officer Seiferd's broadcast that the passenger in the suspect vehicle was pointing a gun at him. Immediately after this, he heard Sergeant Coleman stating that she observed the passenger in the suspect vehicle possibly loading a handgun. Sergeant Coleman's broadcast would have confirmed to any reasonable officer listening that it was more likely than not that at least one suspect in the vehicle was armed with a handgun, had fired that weapon at police or citizens. And this information would cause any reasonably trained officer to believe that the suspects in the vehicle were engaged in life-threatening criminal activity. And then while continuing to pursue the vehicle, Officer Brelo states that he heard Officer Seifert again radio that he'd observed the passenger in the suspect vehicle turn around and pointed what Officer Seifert believed to be a handgun at him out the rear window. And during the pursuit, he heard Officer Coleman broadcast that the suspect vehicle had rammed one of the unmarked detective units. To any trained officer who was already aware of the reckless driving and the high speeds the suspect driver was performing, and at least one suspect in possession of a firearm and had fired it, would have not only been a clear indication of the desperation of the suspects, but that the suspects wouldn't hesitate to use deadly force to resist capture. While continuing to pursue the suspects in vehicle, Officer Brelo reports that he heard Sergeant Coleman radio that she'd observed the passenger suspect to possibly loading a handgun, and I believe this was again. The broadcast would have been yet another confirmation from 3 officers, including an experienced field supervisor, that the suspects in the vehicle were armed. Based on this additional information and confirming information, it would have been objectively reasonable for any trained officer to believe that, again, that the suspects were armed with at least one handgun. It is known that once the suspect vehicle entered the grounds of Heritage Middle School, it struck a raised cement island. It flipped around and had contact with Officer Diaz's patrol unit, and Officer Diaz had been one of the pursuing officers. It's also known that Officer Diaz exited his unit.
You know, I thought about this. This isn't getting in what Diaz says as substantive evidence. This goes to what forms the basis for his opinion, and on cross you can make it, well, on cross you can inquire of the witness whether what he relied on is in fact evidence in the case, and at least as of now, Diaz's testimony, as we know, is not in evidence. So I think that's the basis of your objection. It's overruled.
Continue, please.
Thank you,
Judge,
sir.
I have one more on the basis, and that is there's no question to this individual. All he's doing is reading his report.
Well, that is a concern of mine. It can be a bit awkward. You should intersperse from time to time. What else did you learn? Something like that.
You're enumerating the reasons supporting your opinion stated in number 1. You have...
The rule on the stipulate that he wrote what he's reading. That
Right.
saves time.
Well, thankfully, appreciate
The
it.
whole report.
Well, the defense wants to get his opinions into evidence unless you're stipulating, I guess, to the admission of the report, which I don't think you will based on the other things. Like I said, it can be awkward, but at least throw in a question from time to time.
I will, Your Honor.
Question.
I mean, we can make this short. If you want to stipulate the report comes in, I can do this in summary fashion, and the judge can...
We'll stipulate that he wrote what he put in the report so he doesn't have to read it. That's all. We've all read the report several times.
Yeah, but it's
But
still...
if he wants to read it to us, it's fine. He's the one in a hurry, so if he wants to keep reading the report, go ahead.
We'll continue.
So,
I
do you
take
have
it
a
by
question?
that he's not agreeing to stipulate that it may be received in evidence for the court. Okay, that's fine. Then we'll continue. Please state your rationale for that's set forth on page 22, item number 9. The reasonable belief of imminent threat to life.
Sure. Well, essentially, Officer Brelo was of the knowledge that the people being pursued, Russell and Williams, were armed. They pointed at least one gun and fired that weapon at citizens or officers. I've discussed that.
Objection.
Are you objecting because what? There's no evidence that ever occurred?
Correct, Your Honor. He's misstating any of the evidence that are in any of the reports. There was never any reports that shots were fired from that car during the chase.
He referred to Officer
Well,
Dan.
hold on. He's talking about...
Besides all shit.
Yeah, that's what he's referring to here.
Right.
We're not asserting that shots were fired at anyone during the course of the chase,
Sorry to get
other than at the end.
And anyway, cross-examine him to
Right.
make it clear that that there's little other evidence beyond Nan's testimony about a shot being fired.
Thank you.
Please continue.
And Mr. D'Angelo, I believe I prefaced my comments by saying it was Officer Brelo's belief that these things, or knowledge that these things had taken place at the time.
Okay.
So,
If we can, go back to page 17 of your report, and these are factors that are submitted in support of your opinion, correct?
That is correct.
What are officers taught relative to their use of force that you have in item 1.3?
Officers are taught that they can rely on information that comes from other persons. They can rely on information that comes from dispatchers, witnesses, other officers, other municipal workers, to establish both reasonable suspicion or probable cause to effect detentions, arrest, or in fact to use force.
What are officers taught relative to when they can use force?
The calculus of force for an officer is based on their experience and their observations, and they learn that there is a balance between the governmental need and the intrusion upon the individual. So when the governmental need is great and imminent, in other words, there's something very serious happening, and it's happening right now, and someone's at peril, no matter if it's the officer, partner, or third party, they can use force that is reasonable force in order to accomplish capture, overcome resistance, or protect themselves and other people.
In item 1.6, what's the scope of the ability of an officer's ability to use that force?
Well, officers are also trained that they need not necessarily use the least intrusive level of force, only that level of force that in consideration of totality of circumstances is ultimately seen to be objectively reasonable. And
how do you further describe that in item 1.8?
And they're also trained that the reasonableness of a particular use of force must be judged from the perspective of the reasonable officer on the scene and his understanding of the totality of circumstances rather than consideration of 20/20 hindsight.
Are officers instructed that they must retreat?
No. As a matter of fact, they're instructed that officers can continue to engage, can pursue, can prosecute a detention, an arrest, and not be in use force, as a matter of fact, and not be seen as the aggressor. They are advised and trained that they need not cease, desist, or retreat in the face of resistance.
Do officers have an obligation or a duty to act?
Depending on the exigency.
And in item 1.10, do you describe that?
Right. The officers are trained and they have an obligation to protect people and provide public safety.
So in this case, did the officers have the discretion to say, "Oh, heck with it, let that car go"? Did Officer Nan have that discretion to say, "I'm not going to pursue that car"?
Based on what I've reviewed and the exigency of the matter and what the officers state that they reasonably believe that there was a shot being fired, especially going past the Justice Center, the officers would not want to cease and desist. They would want to pursue the suspects and try to capture them for public safety.
Can officers be prosecuted for dereliction of duty if they fail to act?
Well,
Well, of course, in this case, the answer is self-evident, but overruled.
that's correct, and they can be administratively disciplined as well.
And what are they trained relative to conforming their actions to best police practices?
Well, we don't use the word best police practices. We use the word professional police practices. So the officers are trained that their comportment, their behavior, and their actions have to be consistent with recognized, acknowledged, and used police practices throughout the nation, in their state and throughout the nation.
And with respect to item 1.12, the next page, could you please set forth your rationale in that paragraph?
Well, officers are taught that it would be objectively reasonable to use deadly force if they reasonably believe that at the moment that force was applied, they or another person were in imminent danger of serious bodily injury or death.
Does that risk of harm have to be actual danger?
No, it does not. It
What
has
may
to
it be?
be a reasonable belief.
And that's based on a reasonable perception?
Correct. In the totality of circumstances as experienced and or believed to be occurring at the time by the officer or officers involved.
Are officers trained that they must give a warning prior to the application of deadly force?
No, they are not. They are actually trained that whenever safe and practical, they should issue force warnings that allow the suspect who might be resisting to consider that future resistance could bring a force response. But when it's not safe and practical to do so, there is no such requirement. This is the way that they're taught.
If you can, turn to page 22 of your report, item 9. Again, you provide there that Officer Brelo had a reasonable belief of imminent threat to life. Could you please explain what you mean in that paragraph?
Certainly. Number one, his belief, as stated, was that suspects Russell and Williams were armed with a handgun. The suspects had pointed at least one handgun at officers and at Officer Brelo and more. And the suspects had fired at police, and the suspects were ramming police units and intentionally driving their vehicle towards themselves. And so, I listed, a number of circumstances, facts, statements and evidence. One was that numerous officers, including Officer Brelo, reported stating that the suspects in the Malibu were pointing a gun. We've covered that. Officer Sistick, who was the passenger vehicle in Unit 238, had exited his vehicle immediately before the suspect vehicle struck it and had disengaged while firing upon the vehicle. Officer Brelo and Officer Moore saw the suspect vehicle strike Unit 238 and start moving towards their vehicle, which was in very close proximity. And Officer Brelo and I believe Officer Moore stated that they believed that the suspects in the vehicle at the time were pointing something, which the officers state that they believed was a weapon. And with the reactionary gap issue of distance versus reaction time, they both felt that the vehicle coming towards them constituted a deadly force threat. You want to get hit by a vehicle, and also the officers pointing what they believed to be handguns at them constituted a deadly force threat.
What is that action-reaction perception lag time that you just referenced? What is that?
Well, there's two different issues. They're intertwined. One is referred to as the reactionary gap, and officers are trained that the reactionary gap is a formula of distance versus reaction time. So the closer that an assailant or a threat is to the officer, the less time the officer has to react to something that the suspect is doing that is threatening. Okay? The farther away, the more time the officer might have to react if there's no other distractions. Perception reaction lag time is a psychophysiological dynamic where research and in cases prove to us again and again that a human being takes a certain amount of time to recognize a life threat. And then, and I'll tell you what basically it is, it's about 58 hundredths of a second to recognize a life threat, experience it. In other words, hear it, see it, feel it, and then question, is this a life threat or not? Am I really seeing what I think I'm seeing? Number two, the human being needs to react to that threat, and there's 5 basic things that a human being can do to react to a life threat.
What's that?
Number 1, they can take defensive action or fight. Number 2, they can disengage or flee. Number 3, they can posture. They can yell, they can scream, they can point their finger. Number 4, they can experience hypervigilance, which is defined as panic, confusion, and freezing. And number 5, they can submit or surrender.
So in this particular case, would the Malibu coming directly at zone car 217 be a circumstance where you're dealing with that close distance that would make that reaction gap become an issue?
Yes, you have two major issues going on in that scenario. Number one, you have time compression and you have distance compression.
And could you please elaborate on that?
Sure. Time compression means, again, going back to reactionary gap. The closer that the threat is to the officers, the less time that they have to react. And then you have to deal with the compression reaction lag time, right? And then you've got distance. So, again, the distance compression and the time compression. And they both work against the officer.
And then the 0.58 seconds you alluded to, is there also another period of time it takes once an officer makes the judgment to stop firing, how long that takes to actually implement?
Yes, sir. On average, the studies show that it takes about 0.56 seconds. So 0.58 seconds to experience the threat and process that threat, and 0.56 seconds to initiate some sort of response. So you're over a second right away.
When an officer does then engage and use deadly force, what's the research show as to how long it takes the officer to process the information to stop firing?
Well, there's several mechanical things that are involved. We've talked about experiencing the threat and processing the threat. Now we've made a decision to take a defensive response or fight against that threat. And so that's taken well over a second and a half. Now what we have to do is take a gun, and we have to manipulate that gun. So in other words, we have to physically move that gun. We have to put that gun on target, point that weapon, attempt to aim it, and then we have to fire that gun. And that can take, obviously, additional time.
It can object. All this stuff he said the last 5 minutes, not in his report. Everything he talks about, the 5 reactions, hypervigilance, I don't find that in any of his report.
The hypervigilance, and that is in the report, and also this is expanding on the action-reaction, and he's already testified, you haven't objected, and he's in the middle of continuing his answer to another question.
Well,
None of this is in the report.
here's what we'll do.
He mentions hypervigilance, sure, but he doesn't go on to all these psychological factors.
It does too.
Well,
On page 29, Your Honor, there's the 5 factors that he just discussed.
I'm going to hold off on ruling on the objection. You know, the report is 39 pages, but we'll take a short break with this question out there. So you can't talk to counsel about the pending question.
Yes, sir, I understand.
You remain under oath, and I guess 15 minutes because I want to take a break, but also look at the report.
Thank you.
So thank you. We're off the record.